Welcome to episode 4 of the NeuroMarvels. I cannot believe we are here at episode 4 already. I am Dr. Gwen Palafox, a neurotypical psychologist who shares a love and affinity for Diet Coke with Dr. Dana Waters. Dana?
Hello, I'm Dr. Dana Waters. I am an autistic psychologist who also loves Diet Coke. And I am neurodivergent. I guess if I'm autistic, I'm neurodivergent, right?
Yeah.
I'm excited about episode 4. 4 is one of my lucky numbers, and then multiples of 4. So 4 is going to be a fun one for me.
4, yeah. Then 4 is destined to be good.
Yeah.
I will say that will offset that 4 is an unlucky number in the Chinese culture. So
that's right. Yeah. Yep.
So I'm going
with
fives
and odd numbers. Yeah.
I'm going with yours. I'm going with the good stuff, Dana, here. In today's episode, Dana and I really wanted to I feel like Dana and you and I, we talk about nuanced things. You know, it's creating spaces for us to be curious, for us to have conversations, for us to get messy with a topic even. And I think today's episode is going to get messy.
Yeah, well, we're going to talk about ABA, so that's big mess. It's inherent, right?
Yeah. So I wonder, just as a start, can you help our audience understand or even kind of know theoretically what ABA is and what it stands for?
Yeah, ABA stands for Applied Behavioral Analysis, and I think it's been used for a very long time in the treatment of autism, especially autistic kids. I believe it has its roots in working with kids that have sometimes that don't speak or have what the outside world will deem as really problematic behaviors. And so the idea of let's sort of rewind a little bit. We can go back and have a history lesson and talk about Skinner and Pavlov a little bit. So everybody probably knows Pavlov, right? He's the guy that people heard of the idea of a Pavlovian response. And this was a neurologist years and years ago who was working on something called classical conditioning. And he wanted to know if he could train these dogs to do certain things. Most of us know he can train dogs like to give their paw and sit and those kinds of things. They're amenable to learning. And so what he wanted to know was, could he present something else at the same time as this meat powder that would make the dogs salivate? So when you give the dogs this treat, they get all drooly in anticipation of the meat powder. And so what he did is he paired a bell at the same time he was giving the meat powder, did that for X amount of time. And then he was able to elicit that same physiological drooling with just the bell. So that was really it was sort of groundbreaking at the time, right? Because it was a lot about how do beings learn, right? Because if we had to, in our brain, lay down everything just in its own sort of dedicated folder, our brain would run out of room. So we pair things together, and it's sort of how you can, how kids learn chains of behaviors when they're really young, when their brain is still developing. So that was a pretty big breakthrough, right? Skinner then comes along and wants to look at things like reward and punishment. Like if you think about it, if you've ever had a dog, and even to a certain extent cats, because cats are actually fairly trainable too, and you have a puppy, let's say, and you want to teach that puppy to give its paw, right? So you'd have it sit and you'd say, give me your paw. And then anything that gets close to that puppy giving you the paw, you would reward that behavior. So in the case of a dog, you'd give something like a little treat, right? So they learn to pair that giving the paw with that command with something positive, and that's what we call reinforcement, right? And the idea of reinforcement is to make that behavior continue, right? And then if you've had a dog where you've taught, what you do is you keep giving treats, and over time you can give the treats less and less, and you can start to give different forms of reward, like, oh, good boy or good girl, or other forms of positive reward to make those behaviors happen. Okay. The opposite of that, then, he also experimented with how do you make behaviors go away? And so reward was a way we could make behaviors increase, and punishment is a way we can make behaviors decrease, right? So, and then there's a nuanced way of creating, making behaviors disappear, is just the withdrawal of reward, right? And so that is actually what we call negative reinforcement. Everybody kind of gets it wrong. They think negative reinforcement means we're being mean, but negative reinforcement simply means we're taking the reward away. And punishment's a little more active. This would be like every time your dog raises its paw, you'd slap it, right? It'd be something really unpleasant that you do to that dog. To do what we would call extinguishing that behavior. Okay? So Skinner did a bunch of work with other animals. He also had this thing called a Skinner box, where he was teaching birds to peck at this lever, and he played with different forms of reinforcement and how often they happen. Are they predictable rewards? Are they not predictable rewards? Which gets way beyond the scope of this podcast. But the basic idea, if you think about how can I reward behavior and make it increase, and more importantly, if we're going to be talking about ABA, is how do I decrease a behavior by either taking a reward away or punishing. So ABA sort of came out of this idea of autistic kids having behaviors that don't fit in the neurotypical world, or that they wanted to get rid of them. Stimming being a really good example, whether it's rocking or finger rolling or something that they deemed as disruptive. They might, in any way they can, whether it's talking to the child or actually applying something really negative, right, to try to get that behavior to stop happening. Or when the child would stop, the child would get a reward of some kind. Depending on the age of the child, it might be praise, it might actually be a food treat, it might be in a little bit older kids, you can say you're not going to get screen time unless you stop rocking, and so, right? So the basic idea of applying this, that's what's called applied behavioral analysis, is interesting. I would sort of just say it's applied behavioral methods, right? Humans are, and really most animals now, we know that aside from like a little, one-celled organism in a petri dish, but we know that most animals that have an evolved upper brain, what we call the neocortex, and a nice big frontal lobe, like mammals, songbirds, actually, most animals that we come in contact with have that, have feelings about these things happening, right? So it's one thing to make a dog drool at the presence of a bell, right? It's another thing to take away or punish a child for something that the neurotypical world deems inappropriate, but is really essential for that child to have and regulate. And the one example I'll use is stimming. We see little kids rocking more often that are autistic, and it's actually a way of self-soothing. It's a way of bringing down sensory input if it's too high. And if that's a behavior that gets extinguished, right, they actively work to have the child not do that. Now you've taken a resource away from that child, right? And so as ABA had been around longer and longer, it really got deemed as fairly cruel, right? I mean, you're applying these things that are can be punishing, taking away basic resources that humans need, and a lot of debate arose around whether this is ethical, whether it's malfeasance, it's not good treatment, et cetera. Then we started to see this really, I'd say interesting as a psychologist, but kind of messed up findings about 10 years ago. Now we started to see folks that grew up with ABA as children become adults. And there's something like a 97% concordance rate in folks that have gone through ABA as children in terms of them ending up with PTSD. That's really compelling, right? So these kids are growing up and they're having trauma reactions to what's being done to them. So the the autistic community, the neurodiverse community really started pushing back and really started advocating for ABA to go away and for it not to be best practice, right? In our field, it's a little bit weird. We have this thing called evidence-based, and certainly, we're not practicing in the Middle Ages. We want to make sure the methods we're using, things like that, for working people in therapy, that they actually work, right? And when we use CBT kinds of things, cognitive behavioral therapy, or like something like a applied behavioral thing, you can see the results. You can measure the results. They tend to show up pretty quickly. And they're easy to measure in a short period of time. And that's, I think, why they got really popular and why it became what we call, the gold standard for treating autistic kids. And now that mindset's starting to change a bit. There's a lot of folks that have worked in ABA for years that are starting to say, this is kind of messed up. There are some schools of thought and a place still in Massachusetts that actually applies shock to these folks. It was outlawed for a while, and then that lawsuit fell, and now in Massachusetts there's this crazy shocking device that you can use on folks, which is most people, if you tell them you're shocking a kid, they'd be horrified, right? What's interesting about ABA is if you mention ABA to anybody who's an adult in the autism community who's kind of aware of what the community thinks about it, will really get a pretty visceral reaction. There are some applications of ABA, or that ABA has been modified in a way to really get rid of the cruel kinds of aspects of it, and really can be more along the lines of like what parents would do, which they'd say, if you are going to not clean up your room, it means you're not going to have any clean clothes to wear to school, and you're going to have to wear dirty clothes. I mean, parent might do something like that, right? So that actually is, at the heart of it, that is a version of behaviorism that we would say. You're conditioning that kid to want to clean up their room. There's a reward if you do, and a punishment if you don't, assuming you wear dirty clothes, and that doesn't go well for that kid at school. So it really is sort of, the other big piece of that is children that are autistic, assuming there isn't a intellectual functioning issue as well. And even to a certain extent, I'm not excusing ABA for folks that have intellectual impairment, but it used to be thought that kids under a certain age really didn't understand what was going on, particularly if someone is non-speaking. Now we know there's this whole inner world, and it may just be their inability to express themselves to people that are working with them. So now, I do know some folks that used to practice ABA the way it was taught, sort of classical way, that are still doing it, but are doing it in a much more loving way and much more explaining way to try to actually foster understanding in kids. And I say it's no longer ABA at that point. We need to rename it, right? Because there's so much. It's like you use the word Hitler or the Third Reich, you can't use those words anymore. The N word, just don't do it. There's too much attached to it.
Yeah.
So it almost needs to be, you really are, I always call it reparenting or like supplemental parenting. It becomes a form of bringing more structure or lattice work to support that child versus this really cruel kind of, I'm going to take away your resources. I'm going to force you into this box to be the way I want you to be. And if you don't, it's a problem. Right? There's also a lot of other people, and even people that train dogs. I was a vet tech for 17 years. I know a lot about training animals. And we know that doing simple reward training works better. It takes a little longer. It works better though. And then you've got, if we're talking about dogs, right, you actually have them less fearful, you have them less traumatized, and they tend to be happier. If you treat them with respect and you somehow reward good stuff. And it used to be thought, well, they're not smart enough to understand what it means to not have reward, but it's actually proven untrue. And so obviously with children, we know that to be inordinately true, especially if you've got a child who's over a certain age that can understand basic reasoning, assuming how old they are. They get it, right? So you might even explain to them, here's the scoop with that. Or you might even go out to the school and say, this child needs to be able to rock back and forth or finger tap or whatever it is during a test, right? We can actually make the environment be the thing that moves around that child rather than cramming something down in that child or punishing them for something that is actually a natural thing that their brain is doing to cope with having different neurology. But it's a big bone of contention. There's a lot of feelings about it on both sides of the camp. And I really want to, I'm a psychologist, right? So you are too, and you studied the field of psychology and its history. And it's sort of amazing, these steps that we've taken to get to where we are today. And, basic learning theory, how do we learn? Yep. It is mostly through reward, right? some through punishment, but we actually learn mostly through reward. And that's sort of what's at the roots of this, and why there's such a big pushback around this being cruel and unusual punishment for, especially if you're talking about a vulnerable population, children that can't advocate for themselves. There's a gentleman who lives in the UK. His name is Chris Bonello, and I think his social media name is Autistic Not Weird, or weird and autistic, something like that. He did a really interesting study over a period of years. He had 60,000 respondents. He got people that are autistic. He got caregivers of people that are autistic. He got people of all the way from, I think the youngest was 13, all the way to in their 80s. And what he found in this particular thing about how you feel about ABA, of 7,500 respondents of people that are autistic, only 1.63% of those folks supported the use of ABA. 87% of people disapprove it. And these are people that have been through ABA themselves as kids. Now, if we can't go to the source of who've experienced this and ask them, what was it like? And almost 90% of them are going to say, no, it's horrible, you should never use it. That's really compelling. And then we get into what we've talked about before, that labelism, like who's in power, who isn't in power. Are we giving voice to the folks that belong to those communities? Or is it just the sort of colonial model of I'm the doctor and I know better and I do these things to you? So there's so much about it that's exciting now. We're learning more about it. This study is amazing. It even surprised him. He really didn't think the response would be that strong, right? And then 6% or so in there somewhere were just people that said they didn't know. But over 90%, Gwen, for any sort of questionnaire is a pretty significant number, right?
The fact that it got 60,000, did you say 60,000, Dana?
60,000 respondents throughout the whole world, everywhere, all different countries.
Yeah. It's something, my experience with ABA, was way back. It was my first introduction to autism in grad school. And my first real job was as a therapist, an in-home therapist, ABA therapist. And I, went through all the trainings, Autism Partnership, LOVAS, Center for Autism-Related Disorders. I mean, I was definitely here and receiving all that training. And I think in my neurotypical way, and obviously this was 25 years ago, so this is a long time ago. And I'm, I'm a different person now today, but talk about ableism. I mean, it was this idea that the stimming was odd and weird. So we needed to eliminate that. That was for sure. That, you needed to mold and mesh to your environment wherever you went. And so we needed to train compliance, and we needed to train table ready behaviors, and we needed to train eye contact. And, today, as we're listening, and I'm listening to my clients, to the community, in how traumatic this is. I, more and more so look back with a lot of shame. And I think for you and I, it was important for us to have one of our first episodes out of the gate to really address our feelings about ABA and the challenges, because, in agreement with, gosh, we need to call this something else. If you change the way in which you're delivering treatment, the first thing to my mind is in ABA, it's an adult-centric treatment. The child doesn't decide or give consent about what they're learning. So if you surround that kiddo with neurotypicals that have good intentions, I'm not saying the intentions are bad, but we're not looking at sensory profiles and sensory sensitivities. We're not looking at cognitive abilities. We're not looking at, even like special interests and splinter skills and strengths. If we're not looking at all those things, we clearly then say you need to act like the neuromajority, and we're going to train you to do that. That just doesn't, today, I mean, I see it now. It doesn't work. Then 25 years ago, I thought I was like, I was doing the work. I was still like,
Yeah. That's a really good point because as the field continues to grow and we learn more about all these things, no one would ever think of putting I shouldn't say that because they probably Skinner did actually train his own baby to be afraid of furry things, like seriously scared of furry things. So you'd never be able to do that now, but you wouldn't put a child in a cage and feed it pellets through this thing that it has to hit a lever for. But as ridiculous as that sounds, it's like, well, that kind of stuff 100 years ago was kind of happening. But as we evolve and we learn more about stuff, right? And really, just what you were talking about is we go to the source of the folks that have this lived experience. So then we can go back and talk about using language of if you are in terms of oppression, are you an agent? Do you have agent rank or are you target rank? And agent rank are those that have the privilege and are in power, and the target rank are those that don't, right? And so we could say the adult ableistic, this is the way you have to be, those would be the agents, and the target obviously would be the child, right? So it goes back to that not about us, without us sort of thing. It's almost like ABA had to be around long enough for people to grow up and say, wow, that was really messed up. And that's how the process of change happens. We were doing things in medicine 100 years ago that we laugh at now. I would hope that we continue to keep evolving in psychology as well. But, along the way, we really had a lot of people that got really hurt, have had a lot of damage done. And you still see a lot of people that are pretty hardcore ABAers. And then I know people that are like, oh, God, this is terrible. I need to modify my ways. And collaboration should be in there somewhere, age appropriate.
Yeah, of course.
You're not going to be able to have a conversation like this, with a 3-year-old. They're obviously not developed enough to understand that. But even a 3-year-old knows enough of whether you're acting out of kindness, using reward, being genuine about it rather than being mean and saying you shouldn't do that, right? And it really does. We talked about masking a couple episodes ago, or last episode. And this is really forced masking. It really is about when you force someone to mask during their developmental years, you actually impoverish and skew their personality and who they are. And then you get all these adults, and I went through this myself before I even knew I was autistic, but I have a lot of clients that are working on like, well, who am I? I don't even know who I am, right? So being able to go back and look at what things make you feel good, what things don't make you feel good. And it's almost like having to go through that childhood and adolescence piece again to find these pieces that you had to push down because they were trained out of you, right?
Yeah. Punished out of you.
Yeah.
I mean, in my early days, this was 25 years ago of ABA, aversion training was still in effect. That was, if we look at the history, just like of the psychological history of this, Pavlov, right? We've got Pavlov in the 1900s. Early 1900s is Pavlov.
Yeah.
With Skinner, maybe what? A couple decades after-ish?
30s-ish.
20s, 30s, right?
Yep.
We've got Lovaas at UCLA in the 1960s.
Okay.
Right. So when you see, and then that's really, I think, where ABA was really applied to the autistic population.
Right,
so 1960s, really hitting steam in the 80s.
Which would have been, in the 60s also, there was this huge thing going on where you couldn't just institutionalize people in mental hospitals against their will anymore.
Yeah.
And so people had to be let out. And then you see therapies like this showing up for these folks that normally would have been institutionalized.
Yeah.
So that's probably why that came along in the 60s, because mid-50s is when they deinstitutionalized folks.
Well, and even in that, Dana, if we think about the history of the diagnosis, it was autism was a differential or became a differential from childhood schizophrenia.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
With the heart of that diagnosis being refrigerator mother.
Yeah.
Right. The cause of the diagnosis. was
Yeah.
refrigerator
An
mother, so
unloving mother. Yep.
unloving cold
Cold mom.
mother, right?
Yep.
I mean, the diagnostic, I mean, and even diagnostically, we had that pervasive developmental disorder umbrella
Yeah.
with then
Yeah.
the PDD, pervasive developmental disorder, NOS, not otherwise
Yeah.
specified,
We
which
don't
is
really
like
know what's going on.
trash
Yeah.
bin diagnostic category or whatever. Now
Right.
it's
Right.
just autism spectrum disorder, different levels,
Yeah.
no
And so it's
Asperger's.
still the disorder word in there, you know?
Still the
Yeah.
disorder word is in there, kind of going back to our
Mhm.
labelism kind of episode
Mhm.
with this,
Yeah.
which is episode 1. But I guess like systemically, we have a diagnostic medical system that
Mhm.
defines autism through pathology. And
Yeah.
so when you have something like ABA come in, right? It's
Mhm.
basically fixing the pathology. It's
Get
it's
rid of the
it's
pathology. Yeah. It's
getting
not
rid
even
of it.
fixing. Yeah, it's just
Right.
getting rid of it. Yeah.
Eliminating.
Yeah. Yeah.
Which is, if you had raised this point of stimming, self-stimulatory behaviors or
Mhm. Mhm.
stimming,
Mhm.
and that stimming is my clients tell me, and I mean, weigh in on this, stimming is
Mhm.
regulatory.
Exactly. It's soothing, it's regulatory. Depending on when you're doing it, it can serve different purposes. But for the most part, it's a way to ground and sort of deal with overwhelm and
Yep.
being overstimulated. Yeah, for
Yep.
sure.
And so if we look at that, some of my this is how I've helped some of my teams differentiate
Hmm.
between stimming and an obsessive
Yeah,
kind of
yeah,
behavior.
yeah.
My clients have taught me this. Stimming feels good, obsessive behavior feels bad.
Yeah,
Yes.
obsessive behavior almost feels like it's a have to, like you can't control it. And
Right.
stimming is something you choose to do, which
Right.
is different. Yeah, yeah.
Right. Yeah. And an OCD or those obsessive or the compulsive kind of category of behaviors,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm.
My
Hmm.
clients who have OCD, as well as being autistic,
Hmm.
the compulsions are so distressing because they can't
Yeah.
control them. And so that's a really important thing to empower teams with. And then inevitably on an ABA team, you've got,
Mm-hmm.
a supervisor, usually with a BCBA, and then you've got an
Uh-huh.
RBT level, lower level therapist. But sometimes these people are like 20,
Yeah, and
19.
don't
They're
just have or don't even have an undergrad degree,
right.
and really don't know like sort of the theoretical and the psychological underpinnings of all this. And I think you and I are really in doing this podcast to try to really promote understanding and explain a little bit about what's behind the curtain, right? These things aren't just sort of come out of nowhere. It's what's behind the curtain, and that's really what we do in therapy for people to understand. Is you were talking about stimming, right, and just being autistic in general. I was thinking if it's disorder and we have to get rid of these behaviors. I was thinking about how many people I've worked with and my own journey about how much the neurosis or whatever you want to call it just melted away once I realized, or folks are like, oh, I'm autistic. Yeah, explain. It's like what happens is there's understanding now. It's like, oh,
Yeah.
that's why. And then it doesn't become this like, I'm having to skate on 3 wheels instead of 4 and I'm always off kilter. It's like, oh, okay, that makes sense. And if it were really just pathology, why would just insight change everything? It wouldn't,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
That insight gives a frame for it. You can understand why you're doing certain things. And then what you brought up, like with the difference between disordered version of OCD, which for folks that don't understand, it's obsessive compulsive disorder. So obsessiveness, pretty much all autistics have, and a lot of other people do too. Most of us that have pursued and earned a doctoral degree are fairly obsessive. It keeps us, what I call my terrier mind that can't let things go and just has to keep trying, has to keep trying, has to keep trying until I can solve it. So obsessiveness. The compulsive thing is the behavior thing. And so the compulsive thing people have heard about, like people that have to check their locks before they go to bed, but they have to check it a bunch of different times, and it's almost like this felt sense of how many times I've checked the lock, now I can go to bed. And it really is kind of a magical thinking that if I do this, I'll be safe, or if I don't do this, someone's going to break into my house at night. And it really is, even OCD, even the compulsive part of it is can have a behavior component to it because it's sort of trying to get control over things. But we actually know now that the compulsive part of OCD is driven a lot by neurology. Now, there's a priming factor to it, right?
Mm.
And the idea there is to put people in a driver's seat too, even if it's OCD, is to say, okay, I'll do this with my own clients. Let's use the example of, people that don't want to walk on the cracks on a sidewalk because your mom will die, right? So you say, okay, what I want you to do is I want you to purposely walk on the cracks and then call your mom and make sure she's still alive. The idea is sort of to dispel the magical thinking. And then, of course, you pray to God that nothing actually happens to their mother between that and that, because that would be bad. But what happens is you can slowly chip away at that magical thinking. And you're like, oh, this compulsion actually has nothing to do with my thought outcome, right? And if it's a felt sense thing, that is almost more like a stimming thing, right? Because I'll have people that pick at cuticles. I pick at some of my cuticles, and so it's an imperfection thing. And actually, when you really get to the bottom of it, sometimes it's just a way to deal with anxiety. And then you can say, do I give myself permission to do that or not, right? I don't pick most of my fingers anymore, but I still have one thumb that I'm like, I got to have something. Don't take my thumb away, right? So I'll do that. But again, the idea that we've talked about before is let's get these folks in their own, driving their own car. And then it isn't that ableism. It's about working with your therapist, and then you get to decide, right?
Yep.
Do I want to continue to do this or not continue to do this? Or the insight, why do I do that? Gosh, the compulsion to rock is when I'm totally overwhelmed and I'm super anxious and I feel like I have no control.
Yep.
So what do you do then when you feel the urge to rock? Get the hell out of there. Go somewhere where you feel safe. So you start to learn things that go along with those things. And then you have empowerment, which is always the name of the game. It always works better. It's a little harder and more tedious to teach little kids those things because you can't explain it to them like we're saying it. But you can explain to a 5-year-old in 5-year-old language ways that'll make sense to them around that for sure.
Yeah, and I think the other thing too is that we've got to presume competence at all levels. It's like, I mean, this is why I loved Mr. Rogers. And I never understood why I loved Mr. Rogers growing up. But I remember really clearly for me that Mr. Rogers was someone who treated me and respected me like someone that understood things. He spoke about being angry. He spoke about divorce. He spoke about these taboo things that in the 80s, when I was a kiddo, that I was like, oh, we're allowed to talk about that stuff. And then I go back and I love music and musical scores. And you listen to the music of Mr. Rogers, and it's a jazz pianist, who's playing live music during a show. Who would ever do that for children, right? And but I think like we don't presume that they're competent. And then this gets really nasty when we've gotten on speakers who have such significant sensory motor challenges, dyspraxia, that they're not able to use their voices. And
no, I was thinking, sorry, go ahead.
I was just, it's like, and then all of a sudden we think we have carte blanche to make decisions for them. I don't really know why.
Yeah, what came up to when you were talking about that a little while ago too, the image that came to my head was in high school, the first time I saw the play The Miracle Worker, I was mesmerized. Now, the Miracle Worker was the combination. It was the two of them working together. And in that play, that child who's born blind and deaf, capital D deaf, has no way to communicate to the world, right? And so she's moving just strictly on affect, and she get angry about things and wouldn't learn things like table manners and that kind of thing. And Annie Sullivan comes in not to dominate her and make her do those things, but to try to find a way to help her communicate. And it's all about her trying to get in to have that insight of you can communicate, we can find a way for you to speak. And that ended up being like a form of sign language that was physical, that she would do and spell things in her hand, right? And that moment of when she realizes water is what water, I'm just getting choked up even talking about it, everything changed after that. She just wanted to learn every word of everything, and then actually ended up becoming an amazing author, right? So how do you find a way, like you said, non-speakers, it's not that they aren't thinking, it's not that they're not a human being and a person in there, it's that mode of communication is lost, and you have to find a way to do that.
Yep.
So yeah, and I think if you try to teach somebody or condition someone in or out of something when you're not having any any communication with them or not letting them communicate back, it's just barbarism. It really is you imposing your will on this person and forcing them to do something. Versus finding a way to communicate and collaborating. It's always going to go better. And then you're going to have that sense of self not get beaten down. And people actually will develop a gut sense, and people will have self insight and be able to say, yeah, I might get overwhelmed in groups of a lot of people and I might leave all of a sudden. It's nothing personal. It's just what I need to do. Right. Versus sitting there freaking out because they want to leave the party and they don't know what someone else is going to think and are torturing themselves because they've been told by this ABA therapist, stay there, right?
Yeah.
So it really is, it's all about communication and finding ways to do that and collaborating with those behaviors. Yeah.
I think collaboration is the key. You know, how do we create spaces for collaboration? How do we, you know, the other thing too that I'm learning more and more from you and my colleagues and my clients is like the context or the environment is highly influential in the way that somebody is able to function. So,
Absolutely.
you know, with sensory sensitivities on that exist inevitably in autism, right?
Yeah.
It's hard for the person to come to the environment. They really need the environment to come to them. And I get as a neurotypical adult who's productive and successful that my gut says my training too. This is my upbringing.
Yeah.
Well, you're going to need to buck up. Like you're going to need to put your head down and you're going to, this is just life, Gwen. You want to be successful in this world, you're going to need to you're just going to need to make it happen. And I just find like, this is not the way for anyone with a sensory sensitivity.
Yeah, or really anyone. So it's true. You can't tell someone just try harder and turn your hair from black to blonde. I mean, it's that ridiculous, right? So if you have someone, for example, who's struggling in school, neurotypical or autistic, to just look back at my own report cards, needs to try harder. I was trying, you know, I was getting frustrated because I kept trying harder and it wasn't working. So just like you're saying, what needs to happen is a response from the environment to say, okay, how can we do this differently? Do we need to break it down? I can remember my older sister teaching me the secret of multiples of 9. No one had bothered to give me and I felt like, ooh, it's like the secret that no one ever told me. So working with those brains to say, what do you need to learn these things, right? Yeah. And everybody might be a little different. I mean, there's typical learning strategies that can work, but you need to work with that. It's not about just buckling down. It's, if you have to do this one thing, what do you need to do that thing?
Yeah. Yeah. And maybe the encouragement here is interventions need to be child-centered and child-directed.
Yes,
or person-centered, person-directed.
Yeah.
Whether you're doing floor time, which floor time inevitably is child-centered anyway, but you know, whatever you're doing, and especially as psychologists, you're client-centered, you're person-centered. That's the first kind of idea of how do we make this effective, not necessarily right. Because I think that's another neurotypical hang-up, which is, I think I know what's right. What's right, like the right way to behave, the right way to do things, when we're not thinking about what's effective for this individual.
Yeah, and it also brings up a point about that judgment, like what's right by whose definition. And all of us move through life thinking, and the more target ranks you have, the more you second guess, was that okay? Was that okay? Was that okay? And we drive ourselves crazy, second guessing everything. Yeah. But it really needs to, the onus shouldn't be all on the person in the minority group or all on the person in the target group. There should be some response from the environment to help as well. And I think I used that example in one of our other episodes about that scene in Atypical where all the kids in school put headphones on to listen to music during the dance. And then the main character gets to not have headphones on for once in his life and could be dancing with the music down soft. And then you'll hear all this pushback, like, well, but that's the majority and that's a pain. But it's really about human accommodations. I mean, in the United States, we have ADA law. Other countries do those sorts of things. But you should care. It's not that hard to help someone along.
Yeah.
If this isn't working for you, what would work, right?
Yep. Well, and to your point earlier, understanding, like having driving understanding, which is really the heart of our podcast, I think. It's driving understanding and, understanding someone or yourself. Like it has to be done in a space of curiosity and compassion.
Yes.
And formality. Like, I just feel like when we don't have formality in reflection, like self-reflection or goal setting or things like that, when we don't have a formality, it just kind of bumps around in our brain like a pinball in a pinball machine.
Exactly.
It's not very productive. It's just really annoying. And that's for humans. We need formality to understand. And in order to really understand, we really should be in a space of curiosity and compassion.
Yeah, that's what I always say. I'm like the perpetual 2-year-old. I want to be like, why? And that's not to be, well, part of it is to be nosy, because I had a mentor of mine once say, oh, therapists become therapists because we're really just nosy. And I'm like, well, there's a small truth to that. But it really is also to get in there and see how that person's world is put together, because you have to be curious to want to do that. Yeah. And then also to not get in there and say, judging, oh, this is wrong, move this and move that, but more along the lines of, oh, that's how that is. Or, can you tell me about that? I want to understand how this works for you. I want to see you, right? And then we're back to that basic being seen and understood. Everybody wants to be seen and understood.
Yeah.
And some of us have to work harder at that. Yeah. Some of us are given that inherently if we have various forms of privilege, and other people have to fight for it if they don't.
Yep. Dana, I'm thinking about ABA and, as I'm supporting more and more adults in my practice, when they're coming out, something I've noticed, when they're coming out of these pretty formalized ABA programs, on one hand, they learned lots of skills. I think ABA does a really nice job of providing task analyses and frameworks to logically and clearly help someone build skills in this very systematic way.
Sort of I think that becoming,
Yeah, it's like a benefit. Like, I mean, I
like
definitely
models.
And I think it provides a structure for everybody to be able to break down a skill in these kind of bite-sized manageable parts. I think that's it's a beautiful part. Sure. It's a beautiful technique in the ABA framework. Like, I really like that. But as a therapist, how often am I building someone's self-awareness or self-knowledge? Because I know that without the foundation of self-awareness and self-knowledge, self-management, is non-existent. Social relations are non-existent, right?
Right.
But if you've come from a treatment of 40 hours a week of intensity, that is traumatic. So many people are encoding this as traumatic for them. And I really see trauma as like not being able to fully understand or digest something that's happened to me, right? Whatever that is, exactly. Right? So I think, right? But how then can you trust yourself? If you can't speak up and you don't have a voice, I think in our sensory sensitivities episode, we talked about interoception and like just like trusting your felt sense, your state, right? If we have trained that out of someone or punished that out of someone, we've really done a disservice to them to be agents in their life,
right?
As adults.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. You're taking away some of the. I always think of the brain in terms of executive functioning. So a neurotypical brain would be like a house that has, it already has the walls put on and the windows and all that. The framework is in there. It's in there, but you can't see it.
Yeah.
For a autistic mind, it's more like having that scaffolding outside the building to hold things up, and that's the help and the support and notes that you write yourself, or do I need to check in with my body, and am I thirsty? Am I hungry? Do I need to pee? Am I breathing? Whatever that is, can be added external, and really to a certain extent needs to be, because a lot of us are born without that internal structure stuff.
Yeah.
But yeah, if you take a basic sort of thing away from someone, like their need is to rock a little or doodle or whatever, and you say you can't have that. When you're in that constant state of overwhelm, you're just trying to survive through any given day, and you're not going to be able to do anything else, right? So much so to where, like you said, you lose that tether to what really was you. And one of the ways I have folks work with that is try to remember what you did or liked when you were a kid, or kind of what would you be doing right now if you didn't have to take into account one other person, if it was just you, or simply trial and error. Do you like water? Drink some water. See how it feels. Do you like it? Not really. If you don't like it, that sort of thing. Like get various foods. See if you like them or not. But that has to be sort of a deliberate process, because folks get that conditioned out of them to such a great degree that neurotypicals take for granted.
Yeah. And then I think what you and I see are the emotional toll that takes. And then now we wonder why we have someone who's so anxious or depressed, and maybe even, right?
Yeah.
And how do we contend, with that?
Mm-hmm.
Part of me is a little bit, part of me is kind of discouraged in a way, because ABA is such a machine from a funding perspective. It's squarely written into the services that someone can get from a health care perspective, here in California, from a regional center perspective, and it's a moneymaker, right? How do we, and especially in a time where service delivery is quite weak, we have a shortage of people who are providing service. I don't know. I just feels.
I think that's going to come back from the community, like we're seeing with the study that I'd mentioned. We're going to have more people that are adults who are saying that was messed up, and starting to advocate more. And that's sort of how the process of change takes place, right? Sometimes it can happen in these catastrophic changes, but typically it's slow. I think about disability rights in general, to get even here ADA law in place took many years, and a lot of people came on board and felt passionate and pushed against it and so on. And then it no longer is the therapy of choice, or it has to be modified in some way. But you're right. It's become so systemic now. The evil empire of autism speaks, still touts it. This is the way. If it's not this, don't do it. So there's a lot of work to be done. There's a lot of pushback to be done, for sure.
Autism Speaks is a whole nother episode, Dana.
There you go. Exactly.
We can talk about it from two different perspectives, and we'll save that for another episode. But I think what we're getting caught up in here is what ABA does at its core is it doesn't obtain the consent of the person.
Yeah. Right.
That is at the heart of the treatment.
Yeah.
Right.
And how do we do that? Right. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. You raise a good point, because people are probably going to be like, well, Gwen, like, what do you do with a 4-year-old? It's like 4-year-olds should still have choices.
Yeah. Yeah. And even if they're non-speaking, you can, work with feeling cards, or there's all kinds of other resources you can use to try to get them to be able to tell you what's going on with them. You're right. The assumption that they're this empty shell that knows nothing, can feel nothing, is absurd. I wouldn't train my dog that way. Yeah.
Well, I think that's a real sharp point, Dana. It's like, if you wouldn't do that to your dog.
Yeah, you probably shouldn't be doing it to your kids. Yeah.
Maybe. And right. I get it. I think as we're talking about this, I don't want the audience to feel like we don't feel like people have good intentions. Right. I will say most of the people that I interface with, whether it's a parent or someone at a school district or someone at a regional center or someone who's providing service, the intentions are good.
Right.
They
Right.
have good intentions. The
Yeah.
question is, how do we encourage people to think more deeply or
Yeah.
more critically, maybe, about
Right.
why they're doing what they're doing?
Yeah, and what it does, right? I'm thinking of,
Mhm.
like, I went to school to be a vet tech. They taught us a lot about handling animals, and my sister, who's a veterinarian, they actually taught them very little. They just sort of threw them into the science of it, so there were some skills they didn't have. But I remember, so we'd have to like assess risk, right? So if I had a dog that needed something done and it was literally trying to kill us, bite us, why? First of all, why is that dog freaking out? It thinks its life's in danger, right? So going at it fast, grabbing it, hitting it and tackling it to the ground is absurd because they're going to feel more like their life's in danger, right? So we learned to move very slow. You'd get feedback from the dog, right? If you move really slow and it's a quiet environment, and you just go to sit next to them and let them get used to that, and then you might be able to get the lead around their neck and get them used to that. And even then, if I had to restrain a dog to, like, for anesthesia or something, and it was trying to bite me, I would do what I need to do and hold that dog in a way that I'm not going to get hurt, but also isn't going to hurt the dog. I don't want to break the dog's neck or break its back or something like that. It's beside the point then, right? While I'm saying the whole time, it's okay, you're okay. And also, I really do believe in my heart of hearts, I never had malice towards any animal I worked with ever. And they can feel that. They know if
Mhm.
your intentions are good. They know if you're coming at it from a loving place. So I agree with you. That is at the core something that still takes place and needs to take place. But the implementation of it needs to have the voice, or at least the recognition of the being that you're dominating, right? So don't rush in and say, we're going to make this kid stop doing this. But, what's that like? And what do you use that for? And, you can trust me. I'm not just going to hit you upside the head to get you to conform. We're going to talk about it. And
Yeah.
maybe then you can make a choice that you don't want to do it, during your first period of school because kids make fun of you. Let's work on if you want to not do it during first period, and then you can go in the bathroom and stim like crazy and get it all out. That's very different than I'm going to beat it out of you and you can never do that.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I mean, for sure, for sure. Dana, I'm hearing like this kind of like neurotypical idea, like these neurotypical ideas of
Mm-hmm.
things. Some of the things that I hear, from parents early on is like they don't know what's good for them.
Right.
I need to make that decision. And
Yeah.
speaking as a parent, I get it. Like, where do I put my energies um in raising a young person?
Yeah. Yeah.
And that there's a lot of challenges because maybe the behavioral and emotional profile is quite challenging to support.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so I think for us, it's not like yes or no. Like we're definitely not
Yeah.
absolutists in this way.
Right.
Um, but it's like just maybe how do if you have this treatment it going on,
Mm-hmm.
just taking a step back and evaluating,
Yeah.
how do you know it's good for
Yeah,
your
God,
kiddo?
and I think that's the proverbial hardest question, because you're right. Kids aren't fully formed, autonomous adults that can make their own
Mhm.
decisions. Their brain is literally not there yet. So how do you inform the parents? How do you have the system do some of these things in a way that's helpful and collaborative? And or maybe in addition to balance the scale. So if a child does have to learn some of these things that are really hard, um, pay it back. Like, okay, you have the whole afternoon to do whatever you want, or literally, you're not expected to do this 24 hours a day, or whatever else that is. There has to be some sort of balancing, and knowing that it'll take a while. But yeah, you have to um, parent a child. Like, I remember learning in school. There are times where you let a child do something and figure it out for themselves, but them walking into traffic isn't something you want them to figure out by themselves because they'll die, right? And so, where is the in between? And that's the proverbial hardest part about this, I think, is to how to balance it.
Yeah, and lately I've been really trying to encourage parents to take a more gardening approach to parenting
Mm.
versus like an architectural or engineering approach,
Oh, that's a good way to put it.
right?
Yeah,
And it goes like this is not just for neurodivergent kiddos.
yeah,
It's for raising people, which
Yeah.
is, you know, your kiddo is going to grow in the trajectory that they're going to grow in. I mean, that's the
Yeah.
neurology, right?
Right. Right. Right.
How do you create the environment or the habitat, especially for your very sensitive ones, right?
Mm-hmm.
Highly
Mm-hmm.
sensitive ones that have, you know, massive pipelines of sensory information coming into their brains that they didn't
Yeah.
choose to have,
Right.
right?
Right. Right. Yep.
How do we create the environment for them to thrive so that
Right.
their utmost best can be maintained or can be facilitated?
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think that's so hard, just kind of speaking as a parent myself,
Mm-hmm.
really learning like we are in very little control
Yeah. That's right.
of things. And so
Yeah.
I love what you brought up too, Dana, which is this idea of like balancing. So the other
Yeah.
thing that I work with my clients on is like how much, what's the energy spend on X? What will you need
Mm-hmm.
to
Mm-hmm.
recover in order to make it to the end of the day and not be
Right.
completely dead, right?
Yeah.
Or that
Yeah.
idea of how do you keep things in the range of comfort and only
Mm-hmm.
be at the edges or outside of comfort with consent?
Yeah,
Though
because it's so hard because
it's hard.
little kids aren't going to be really good self-reporters potentially, or like you said, be able to say, I'm feeling like I'm on the edge of being fried and I need downtime. And really, a lot of the adults I work with, same thing. And then we teach them to, just like you said, I know I'm going to have this thing, I need downtime and a plan for it. How can you assess when you're feeling a certain way and then react and do something versus a little kid who maybe just gets more and more irritable
Yeah.
until meltdown, right? And
Right.
I love the gardening analogy because you don't put seeds in the ground regardless of the season, right? And you don't put them in the ground and they don't grow. They don't even show up for like 2 months, right? You don't see it, right? So you really
Yeah.
are planting seeds, which is really sort of like having the child understand thematic things. Like if you are able to get through this class, then you get the next period free, or you're not even to like pay attention.
Mhm.
Versus, like you said, the engineering way of doing it, which is the kid says, "I'm feeling overwhelmed," and you say, "Well, that doesn't make any sense. That's not happening." What? They're telling you they're feeling overwhelmed. So, but yeah, when you don't see the payoff of it right away, you have to kind of wait. I would imagine that's incredibly nerve wracking for parents. Yeah.
It's such a long game, Dana. And
Hmm.
even as psychologists, you and I both know that the work we do is slow growth work.
Yeah. Yeah. That's right.
It's not like this immediate gratification
Mm.
because even with insight, while that
Yeah.
might lead to some freedom and self-compassion and some understanding, that doesn't necessarily lead to behavior change.
Right. Right. Exactly.
And so I think these are like the challenging pieces, which is we've got a predominant treatment modality
Hmm.
that
Hmm.
is coming into question by people who have been traumatized by this treatment
Yeah.
modality because time has gone by.
Yeah.
What are we doing about that today? And what do we do in this limbo?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and you go back to come full circle, the definition and what ABA stands for, applied behavioral analysis. Who's analyzing? What perspective is that analysis coming from? And then applied is like you're doing something to this being
Yeah.
versus something more like behavioral collaboration and insight or something along those lines. And
Yeah.
it's longer term work. It's harder and probably harder on everybody, but eventually you get to that point where you're like, ooh, the seeds are growing and the plants are there. And look, now I don't have to intervene with every little thing because that person now has the theme that they can operate out of instead of the 20 different things they're trying to memorize. Right.
Yep. Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think like a takeaway maybe from today's episode is really like really getting a clear understanding of who you are or who your kiddo is.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And then really kind of deciphering what's the best environment, habitat, conditions, if you will,
Yeah.
for
Yeah.
my particular kiddo, which could be different
Yeah.
from even your kiddo to kiddo. You could have multiple kids and they could all learn differently.
Sure.
That
Sure. That's right.
happens.
Yep.
And And then to really start letting that inform
Yeah.
your treatment, the way
Yeah,
treatments
being
are
more
looking.
person-centered, like we said. The middle of that universe is that child, and you need to look at that. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So, what does that look like? I don't know. Any other
Yeah.
takeaways as we kind of like wrap up, like kind of our thoughts on ABA?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I do think there needs to be a little bit more communication between the two camps, right? The hardcore ABAers and then autistic adults. There's so much adversarial nature between the two, and you're terrible and you're doing this, versus, again, let's talk to each other and figure this out together. I mean, there has to be more bridging so they can take in the information as well, want to modify it, understand why it's problematic, and so on. But, that's longer term big work too. Yep.
Yeah. And we're calling for a systemic change.
We are. Yeah.
Systemic changes are not easy.
Mm-hmm.
And I think you and I you and I are believers in putting energy and effort into something, no matter how small it is, if it means something to us and it's valuable. And you and I feel really strongly about this because really, I think it comes down to like human dignity and rights.
And that not about us without us. If you're going to apply something to us, make sure you talk to us about it. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Include the person that it impacts.
Exactly. Yep.
Right? No matter how old they are. Figure out a way to make that connection, to offer the choice, to make it understandable.
That's right.
I found it interesting that your training as a vet tech said attune to the behavior of the dog in order for you to regulate the dog. I mean, that's classic co-regulation and attunement.
That's right. Yeah, exactly.
We don't, that's not taught in ABA, by the way.
Yeah.
I've gone through it all. I've been there. No one teaches about attunement.
That's just messed up. Yeah. To use
it's messed up. And
phrase. Yeah.
Yeah. And then and maybe you and I can do an episode on just like, what does evidence-based mean exactly?
Yeah.
Because even though ABA has the most evidence-based support, we got to look at the methodology of those research studies. We have to look at outcomes. We need to look at, you measured a very specific, rigid outcome when what you and I are talking about is how do you measure emotional well-being and regulation and the power of a relationship. How do you measure them? We just talked about Annie Sullivan. How do you measure?
Yeah, those are bigger outcome variables that are harder to define. The harder they get to define, the more complexity comes. The harder they are to put in an evidence base. For those of you who are listening and can't see, I'm doing air quotes, the evidence base bucket, right? That's a double edge of that, for sure.
For sure, yeah. And that maybe the other thing that we'll end with is relationship matters. No matter what treatment modality you're doing. I mean, Dana and I, being trained psychologists in different treatment modalities, both know that the number one predictor of success in a therapeutic relationship is the relationship.
I know, it's not even about what we're doing; it's the relationship. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, every time. Yeah. If you made it to the end of this episode, yay, you.
Yay.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening. Yeah.
Thanks for listening. And I'm hoping that you'll join us for our next episode where Dana and I will inevitably talk about something we care very deeply about.
Yes. And as always, if you have questions, please send them to us. If you have an idea for a topic, we'd love to hear from you.
Yeah, absolutely. We would love that. Actually, interact with us. We want some interaction. It's just Dana and I over here just talking to each other. So please. All right. Bye, everyone.
Bye.